A racist cop pulls a gun on a black army general and faces a bitter reckoning. This sounds like a scene from a movie, but it unfolded on the quiet streets of Hartford. A decorated general who dedicated his life to serving and protecting his country finds himself on the other end of prejudice and abuse by someone sworn to protect the public. This explosive encounter wasn't just a moment of injustice. It sparked a movement that changed everything. Have you ever experienced unfair treatment like this, or seen someone else go through it? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories of inspiration and change. Marcus Daniels sat alone in his modest living room, the walls adorned with the remnants of his military past. Photographs of comrades, medals of honor, and framed certificates were all that accompanied him in his quiet retirement. A retired lieutenant general, Marcus had dedicated over 3 decades to the service of his country. His days had been defined by action, discipline, and unwavering commitment. Now, they were punctuated by silence. For someone who had once commanded battalions, the stillness of civilian life felt almost alien. As the evening shadows stretched across the room, Marcus stared at a folded letter on his table. It was an invitation from William Carter, the mayor of Hartford, for a private dinner. Carter admired Marcus and had often sought his advice, but this invitation felt different, personal. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to such gestures. His life had revolved around duty, not social pleasantries. His thoughts drifted back to a moment that had defined his career and his character. It was during a harrowing battle overseas, deep in hostile territory. Marcus and his unit were surrounded, their position exposed. Enemy fire rained down relentlessly. Amid the chaos, he had to make a decision: prioritize the safety of a group of civilians caught in the crossfire, or reinforce his weakened line, risking the lives of his men. "Sir, we can't hold this position much longer," a young lieutenant had shouted over the deafening sound of gunfire. Marcus scanned the battlefield, his jaw set. He ordered the evacuation of the civilians first, knowing the move would leave his soldiers vulnerable. "Get those people out now," he barked. The decision had cost lives, men he had trained and fought alongside. Their screams still echoed in his memory, a haunting reminder of the burden of leadership. But saving those civilians had been the right choice, even if it had come at a steep price. It was a moment that encapsulated who Marcus was, a man who placed the greater good above personal or professional cost. Snapping back to the present, Marcus stood and approached the invitation. He picked it up, rereading the neatly typed words. William Carter had written warmly, expressing gratitude for Marcus's years of service and admiration for his character. Despite his reservations, Marcus couldn't ignore the effort. Marcus sighed deeply and adjusted his posture. Social engagements were foreign territory for him. He had lived a solitary life, never marrying, never investing deeply in personal relationships. His loyalty had always been to the uniform and the mission. Accepting this invitation felt like stepping into unknown territory. "Why not?" he muttered to himself, picking up his phone to RSVP. As the night settled over Hartford, Marcus prepared for the following evening's dinner. He chose a simple but well-tailored suit, a reminder of his disciplined nature. In the corner of the room sat a small gift, a bronze eagle statue. It was a gesture of respect and gratitude for the mayor's kindness. But more than that, it symbolized courage and freedom, values Marcus had lived by. The decision to attend felt significant, almost symbolic. Marcus wasn't merely accepting a dinner invitation. He was opening a door to a part of life he had long neglected. However, Marcus could not have foreseen that the journey to the mayor's house would mark the beginning of something far greater than a simple social call. That night, Hartford's quiet streets and his routine would collide with the simmering tensions of prejudice and power, thrusting Marcus Daniels into a new kind of battlefield. The streets of Hartford were quiet, bathed in the dim amber glow of streetlights. Marcus Daniels drove steadily, his mind focused on the dinner ahead. The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the silence, until the sudden wail of a siren shattered his concentration. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror, and his heart sank. Marcus slowed, steering his car to the side of the road. His military instincts kicked in, calculating the situation. He wasn't speeding, nor had he violated any traffic rules. Yet he complied without hesitation, easing the car to a complete stop. A sharp rapping on the window startled him. Marcus turned to see a young officer with a stern expression, his name tag reading M. Carter. The man's stance exuded authority, but his tone was laced with impatience. "License and registration," Carter demanded curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. Marcus nodded, maintaining his composure. Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped? Carter's gaze narrowed, scanning the interior of the car. His eyes lingered on the bronze eagle statue in the passenger seat, then flicked back to Marcus with suspicion. I'll ask the questions here, he snapped. Marcus handed over his documents, watching as Carter examined them with exaggerated scrutiny. The silence between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken tension. What brings you to this part of town? Carter asked, his tone accusatory. Marcus frowned slightly. I'm on my way to a dinner invitation. Is there a problem with that? Carter scoffed, his lips curling into a smirk. A dinner invitation, he echoed mockingly. You expect me to believe that? Marcus felt a flicker of irritation but kept his voice level. It's the truth. If I've done something wrong, please tell me. Carter ignored the statement, stepping back and gesturing for Marcus to exit the vehicle. Step out of the car, now. Marcus hesitated, weighing his options. The demand was unnecessary and clearly motivated by something beyond protocol. But refusing would escalate the situation further. With a slow nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The moment Marcus stepped out, Carter closed the distance between them, shoving him forward onto the hood of the car. Marcus's palms hit the cold metal, and his jaw clenched. Hands where I can see them, Carter ordered. Without waiting, he began patting Marcus down, roughly searching his pockets. There's no need for this, Marcus said evenly, his voice steady despite the indignity of the situation. Carter didn't reply, instead reaching into Marcus's jacket and pulling out a small notepad. He flipped through it briefly, before tossing it back onto the hood. You military? He asked, his tone sharp. Yes, Marcus replied simply. I'm retired. Carter chuckled humorlessly, stepping back just enough to draw his firearm from its holster. He didn't point it directly at Marcus, but held it in a way that made the threat clear. Military, huh? Guess you think that makes you special? Out here, it doesn't mean a damn thing. Marcus straightened slowly, turning his head just enough to meet Carter's gaze. Officer, I've complied with every request. If you're going to accuse me of something, then do it. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way. The directness in Marcus's tone seemed to catch Carter off guard, his expression hardening further. You're awfully confident for someone in your position. Maybe you've got something to hide, Carter sneered, nodding toward the car. What's in the gift box? Marcus exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. It's a gift for the mayor, a simple gesture of appreciation. Carter stepped closer, his grip tightening on his weapon. The mayor? He said with a mocking laugh. Sure, that's believable. How about you lie down on the ground and we sort this out properly? Marcus's hands balled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained calm. No, officer, I will not lie down. I've shown you nothing but respect, and I've done nothing wrong. Carter's face twisted in anger, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. The tension was suffocating, the silence heavy with the possibility of violence. Marcus held his ground, his steely gaze unwavering. If you continue this without cause, I'll have no choice but to report your conduct. I don't take that lightly, and neither should you. The standoff lasted several agonizing moments. Finally, Carter huffed and holstered his weapon. He grabbed Marcus's documents from the hood and shoved them toward him. Get out of here, he said through gritted teeth, his voice dripping with frustration. Marcus didn't respond. He retrieved his belongings and climbed back into his car, his movements deliberate and measured. As he drove away, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. This was more than a routine stop. It was a blatant abuse of power, fueled by prejudice and unchecked authority. Marcus had faced enemies on the battlefield, but this encounter struck a different chord. It wasn't just about him. It was about the deeper issues simmering beneath the surface of society. As the mayor's house came into view, Marcus knew his evening had taken on a new meaning. What had begun as a simple dinner invitation had become the spark of something larger. The warm glow of the dining room failed to dispel the tension that clung to Marcus as he entered Mayor William Carter's home. The mayor greeted him with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile, but Marcus's mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Officer Michael Carter lingered, its weight pressing heavily on him. As they sat around the table, the mayor's wife, Julia, and teenage son, Ethan, joined the conversation. Plates were passed, small talk was exchanged, but Marcus's usual composure was strained. His silence didn't go unnoticed. Marcus, Mayor Carter began, his voice laced with concern. You seem preoccupied tonight. Is everything all right? Marcus hesitated, setting down his fork. He glanced at the eager faces around the table and decided it was better to be direct. I had an encounter with one of your officers on the way here, Officer Michael Carter. The mayor raised an eyebrow. What kind of encounter? Marcus recounted the incident with precision, his tone steady but firm. He described the unwarranted stop, the disrespect, the physical intimidation, and the drawn weapon. The room fell silent as he spoke, every detail landing like a hammer blow. Julia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He pulled a gun on you? For what reason? Marcus's jaw tightened. There was no reason. He saw me as a threat, not a citizen. It wasn't law enforcement. It was harassment. Ethan, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. But you're a veteran. You've done so much for this country. How could he treat you like that? Marcus met Ethan's gaze, his expression a mix of sadness and resolve. Uniforms don't shield anyone from prejudice. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is what he thought I was. Mayor Carter leaned back, rubbing his temples. His face was a mixture of disbelief and unease. I've heard whispers about Officer Carter before, he admitted. Complaints, mostly minor. Nothing concrete enough to act on. Marcus's voice sharpened. How many complaints does it take before action is warranted? How many people like me have to face this kind of abuse? The mayor sighed deeply, his hesitation evident. This is complicated, Marcus. If I move too quickly or too publicly, I risk alienating the police department. I need their cooperation to govern effectively, Julia interjected, her tone fierce. This isn't about politics, William. It's about doing what's right. If this can happen to Marcus, what about someone without his standing? Ethan chimed in, his voice rising. Dad, you always tell me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. This is your chance to do that. The room grew tense as the family's words hung in the air. Marcus watched the exchange, his respect for their moral clarity growing, but he remained focused. This isn't just about me, Marcus said, his tone deliberate. This is about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did. It's about accountability, and that starts at the top. Mayor Carter looked at his wife and son, their unwavering expressions silently urging him to act. Finally, he nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. You're right, he said. We can't ignore this. I'll authorize an internal investigation into Officer Carter's conduct. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady. An internal investigation is a start, but it can't stop there. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem. If we don't address that, nothing will change. Julia added, William, this is your chance to show the people of Hartford what kind of leader you are. Don't waste it. The mayor met Marcus's eyes, a flicker of determination replacing his earlier hesitation. Then we'll do it the right way, he said. I'll push for transparency in the investigation. And if misconduct is found, we'll act decisively. Marcus nodded, his respect for the mayor tempered by a cautious optimism. I'll stand by you, but understand this. I won't back down. Not until the truth is brought to light. The conversation shifted to logistics, the urgency of collecting evidence, and the need to manage the public's response. The dinner plate sat untouched as the room became a war room for justice. As Marcus prepared to leave, Julia stopped him at the door. Thank you for sharing this with us, she said. You're giving us a chance to make things right. Marcus nodded, his expression somber. This is just the beginning. There's a lot more to do. As he stepped into the night, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about one bad officer or one tense encounter. It was about confronting a system that allowed such abuse to thrive. It started subtly. Marcus noticed an unmarked police car parked across the street from his house late at night. At first, he dismissed it, chalking it up to coincidence. But over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Different vehicles, but always the same deliberate presence. Then came the escalation. One evening, as Marcus sat reviewing his notes on the encounter with Officer Carter, a loud crash echoed from outside. He stepped onto his porch and found a trash can tipped over, its contents strewn across his lawn. Further down the street, he saw two officers leaning casually against a patrol car. Their laughter cut through the still night as they watched him. "Problem, General?" one of them called out mockingly. Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he calmly retrieved the trash and went back inside, locking the door behind him. The next day, it got worse. Someone had spray-painted the words, "Stay silent," on his mailbox. When he checked his car, he found scratches along the side, as if someone had keyed it deliberately. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. Mayor Carter was furious when Marcus informed him. "This is unacceptable," he said, pacing his office. "We'll get to the bottom of this." But Marcus's tone was measured. "This isn't about a few bad apples trying to intimidate me. It's about a culture that thinks this kind of behavior is acceptable. If we don't act decisively, it'll only get worse." Carter nodded grimly. He called a meeting with Chief of Police Robert Steele, demanding immediate action. "Your officers are crossing the line," Carter said, his voice sharp. "I want an investigation into Carter's conduct, and I want it done thoroughly." Chief Steele, An older man with a reputation for backing his officers leaned back in his chair. "You're putting me in a tough spot, Mr. Mayor. Carter's a solid cop, maybe rough around the edges, but he gets results. Are we really going to tear apart the department over one complaint?" Carter's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about Marcus Daniels. I've received multiple complaints about Carter, and now we've got blatant intimidation happening in the open. This investigation is happening whether you like it or not." Steele's expression hardened. "Fine. But don't expect this to go over well with the rank and file. You're stirring a hornet's nest." The mayor didn't back down. If they can't handle accountability, they shouldn't wear the badge. As the investigation began, news of Marcus's encounter with Officer Carter spread quickly through Hartford. The community's reaction was starkly divided. Some residents, particularly those who had faced similar treatment, rallied behind Marcus. "He's standing up for all of us," said one woman during a local town hall. "For too long, we've been afraid to speak out." But others viewed Marcus as a disruptor. "This is just political theater," one man argued on a local radio show. "Officer Carter's being scapegoated to make some retired general feel important." The police union added fuel to the fire, issuing a public statement defending Carter. "Officer Carter has always served this community with distinction," it read. "The accusations against him are baseless and politically motivated." The tension spilled into the streets. Small protests formed outside City Hall, with signs ranging from "Justice for Marcus" to "Support our police." The clashes were largely verbal, but the air was thick with hostility. Meanwhile, Marcus prepared meticulously. He documented every detail of his encounter with Carter, crafting a clear and compelling account. He worked closely with the mayor's office, identifying other victims of similar misconduct who were willing to share their stories. During a private meeting with Carter and a few trusted allies, Marcus laid out his plan. "This can't just be about my story," he said firmly. "We need to show a pattern of behavior. The more voices we bring forward, the harder it'll be for them to dismiss this." Carter agreed, but he looked weary. "You're asking people to go up against the police department. That's no small thing. Some of them might back out when the pressure starts." "They're already under pressure," Marcus replied. "This is their chance to fight back." But the resistance from within the police force was fierce. Officers loyal to Carter began spreading rumors, questioning Marcus's credibility. They accused him of embellishing his story, claiming he was using the incident to further his own agenda. Marcus faced the smears with quiet resolve. He refused to engage in public rebuttals, focusing instead on gathering more evidence. But privately, he knew the stakes were high. If they couldn't prove a systemic issue, the entire effort could collapse. The tension reached a boiling point when a group of officers staged an informal protest outside Marcus's house, parking their cars in a line and blaring their sirens intermittently throughout the night. Marcus called the mayor, who dispatched officers to disperse them. But the message was clear. This was a battle they didn't intend to lose. Despite the hostility, Marcus remained undeterred. As the investigation gained traction, more residents came forward with stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of Officer Carter. A young schoolteacher shared how Carter had pulled her over for a non-existent traffic violation, grilling her about why she was driving in a predominantly white neighborhood. A father recounted being stopped and searched while walking his children home from the park. These testimonies, combined with Marcus's own account, painted a damning picture. The momentum began to shift. "We're making progress," Carter told Marcus during a late-night call. "But this is far from over. Steele's still dragging his feet, and the union's doing everything they can to discredit you." Marcus's voice was calm but resolute. "Let them. The truth doesn't need their permission to come out." As the investigation pressed forward, the walls around Officer Carter's unchecked power began to crack. The next phase would be crucial, and Marcus knew the opposition would only grow more desperate. But for every challenge, he had one answer: persistence. Hartford was at a tipping point, and Marcus was ready to push it in the right direction. The tipping point arrived when the mayor's office secured footage from Officer Mike Carter's dash cam. It was late at night when Marcus was called to review the video in Mayor Carter's office. "You need to see this," William Carter said, pressing play. The grainy footage began with Marcus pulling over, compliant but visibly confused. The scene quickly escalated. Carter's voice was sharp, his questions laced with accusation. The recording captured his unnecessary aggression, the moment he shoved Marcus against the hood of the car, and the flash of his firearm as he drew it halfway from its holster. "He never had cause," Marcus said flatly, his jaw tightening. The mayor nodded grimly. This goes beyond misconduct. This is intimidation. We have no choice but to act. Within hours, the footage was shared with Chief Steele, who had no room left to defend his officer. This doesn't look good, Steele admitted reluctantly. He's put us all in a difficult position. The mayor's decision was swift. Carter was placed on immediate suspension pending a formal review. Word spread quickly, and the response was immediate and explosive. The following day, a group of officers and community members loyal to Carter gathered in protest outside the police precinct. What began as a demonstration escalated rapidly. By late afternoon, the crowd had grown rowdy, hurling insults at reporters and passers-by. "Justice for Carter!" someone shouted, followed by a chorus of cheers. Amid the chants, a smaller group of agitators took the chaos further, smashing a nearby store window and tipping over trash cans. A police car parked on the street had its tires slashed. The protest had turned into a riot. When Marcus arrived on the scene, the air was thick with hostility. He stepped out of his car, his presence immediately drawing attention. "There he is," a voice yelled. "This is all his fault." Marcus raised his hands, trying to project calm. "Everyone, listen to me," he called out, his voice firm but steady. "Violence doesn't help anyone. If we want justice, this isn't the way to get it." Before he could say more, a bottle sailed through the air. It shattered inches from him, the glass spraying across his shoulder. The crowd surged, and Marcus barely had time to step back as security intervened, pushing the mob away. Mayor Carter was furious when he heard about the incident. "This has gone too far," he said during a heated call with Marcus. "We need to bring this under control now." "I agree," Marcus replied, his voice measured despite the tension. "But this riot isn't just about Carter. It's about frustration, about people feeling like they're losing power. That won't go away with a single disciplinary action." The following day, a formal announcement was made. Officer Mike Carter was terminated from the Hartford Police Department. The mayor's office released a statement emphasizing the importance of accountability, while the dashcam footage was publicly disclosed to ensure transparency. The reaction was swift and polarized. Supporters of Marcus and the mayor hailed the decision as a victory for justice. "Finally, someone's being held accountable," one community leader said during a televised interview. But Carter's allies pushed back fiercely. The police union called a press conference, condemning the decision as a knee-jerk reaction to political pressure. Protesters outside City Hall held signs reading, "Support our police and stop the witch hunt." The strain on Marcus was palpable. His name was now a lightning rod for both praise and scorn. Rumors began circulating about his military past, questioning his record and motives. Anonymous threats flooded his mailbox, warning him to leave well enough alone. Julia Carter, the mayor's wife, called Marcus one evening. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her tone filled with concern. "I've faced worse," Marcus replied. But the truth was more complicated. While his military training had prepared him for physical conflict, the psychological toll of this battle was unfamiliar territory. Despite the backlash, Marcus remained resolute. "Carter's termination is just the beginning," he told the mayor during a late-night strategy session. "This isn't about one officer. It's about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long." The mayor nodded, though his face was lined with exhaustion. "You're right," he said. "But every step we take makes the opposition louder. We'll need more than public statements if we want real change." Behind closed doors, Marcus and the mayor began drafting plans for broader reforms. Their focus shifted from individual accountability to systemic overhaul, policies that would ensure transparency, fairness, and community oversight. But Marcus knew the road ahead would be even more treacherous. Carter's dismissal had exposed deep fractures in the community and the police department. If they weren't careful, those cracks could shatter everything they were trying to build. The announcement of a new civilian oversight committee was met with mixed reactions. The committee, tasked with reviewing complaints against police officers, was a key element of the reforms Marcus and Mayor Carter had planned. Alongside this, a series of community police workshops were scheduled to open a dialogue and address long-standing mistrust. At the first workshop, the room was packed. Officers in uniform sat stiffly on one side, their expressions wary. Across from them were community members, many of whom had personal grievances with law enforcement. The tension was palpable. Marcus stood at the front, his presence commanding but calm. "This isn't about placing blame," Marcus began. "It's about finding solutions. Together." Before he could continue, a voice interrupted from the back. "Solutions? You mean more hoops for us to jump through while criminals run free?" The room turned toward the speaker, Officer Daniels, a burly man with a confrontational stance. His tone was laced with sarcasm, and several officers murmured in agreement. Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Officer Daniels, I understand your frustration, but accountability doesn't hinder your ability to do your job. It strengthens it. This committee isn't here to punish. It's here to ensure fairness for everyone." Daniels scoffed, folding his arms. "Easy for you to say from where you're standing. You're not the one putting your life on the line every day." Another officer chimed in. "And what happens when we hesitate because we're afraid of being dragged in front of this committee? That hesitation could get us killed." The murmurs grew louder, threatening to derail the discussion. Marcus raised a hand, his voice cutting through the noise. "I've led men into battle," he said, his tone sharp. "I know what it means to make split-second decisions under pressure. But I also know this. Trust between a team and its leaders is what keeps people alive. Without accountability, there's no trust. Without trust, there's no team." The room quieted, though the tension remained thick. Marcus turned his attention to the community members. "Now let's hear from the other side. What does trust mean to you?" A woman in her 40s stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "Trust means not being afraid to walk home at night without worrying that I'll be stopped and treated like a criminal just for existing." Her words hung in the air, cutting through the defenses of many in the room. An older man added, "We're not against the police. We just want to know that when something goes wrong, someone will listen." The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier confidence waning. Marcus seized the moment. "This is why we're here. Not to attack one another, but to understand. That's the first step toward rebuilding trust." The discussion resumed with a more measured tone, though it was clear the divide wouldn't be bridged overnight. Outside the workshop, Marcus faced another challenge. Some community members, especially those who had experienced police misconduct firsthand, were skeptical of the reforms. At a town hall meeting, a local activist named Carl voiced these doubts publicly. "This oversight committee sounds nice on paper," Carl said, his voice echoing through the crowded hall. "But what's stopping the department from ignoring it, just like they've ignored every other complaint we've filed?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Marcus stood and addressed the room directly. "Carl, I won't pretend these changes will fix everything overnight. They won't. But this committee isn't just a token gesture. It's a legally binding entity with real power to hold officers accountable. And it's made up of people from this community, people like you." Carl crossed his arms. "And what happens when the officers push back? They're already complaining about these reforms. How do we know they'll actually change?" Marcus nodded, acknowledging the validity of the concern. "Change isn't easy. Resistance is expected. But that's why this isn't just about policies. It's about culture. That takes time, persistence, and participation from all of us. It's not just the police who need to adapt. We all do." The room fell silent as Marcus's words settled. Despite the challenges, progress was being made. The committee began reviewing its first cases, and the workshops continued, albeit with occasional disruptions. However, the fractures within the police force grew more visible. At a later workshop, the tension boiled over. Officer Daniels, emboldened by a group of like-minded colleagues, openly challenged the reforms again. "This is a waste of time," Daniels declared during a group exercise. "We're being punished for doing our jobs." Before Marcus could respond, another officer, a young woman named Officer Lindstrom, spoke up. "Maybe if you actually listened, you'd understand why these changes are necessary." The room froze. Daniels turned toward her, his expression darkening. "Careful, Lindstrom. You're sounding an awful lot like the people who want to take us down." Marcus stepped in, his voice firm. "Enough. This isn't the place for infighting. We're here to build, not tear each other apart. If anyone has a problem with that, they can leave." Daniels glared at Marcus but didn't move. Lindstrom's words seemed to embolden others, and the discussion continued, though the tension lingered. By the end of the session, Marcus was exhausted but resolute. He met with Mayor Carter to discuss the next steps. These workshops are a good start, Marcus said, but they're not enough. We need to invest in education, cultural competency, de-escalation training, implicit bias recognition. If we don't tackle the mindset, the policies won't stick. The mayor leaned forward. Do you think they'll accept it? The resistance is already strong. They don't have to like it, Marcus replied. They just have to see the results. Once trust is rebuilt, attitudes will follow. Carter nodded. Let's make it happen. As Marcus left the meeting, he reflected on the uphill battle ahead. The reforms had sparked both hope and resistance, but he understood that lasting change required more than laws and committees. It required a transformation of hearts and minds, and that would be the true test of leadership. The threats began subtly, but escalated with alarming speed. Marcus had grown accustomed to the angry glares from officers during community workshops and the whispered accusations in public forums. But the situation took a darker turn late one evening when his phone rang. "Stay out of this," a voice hissed on the other end, distorted but unmistakably menacing. "If you don't, you'll regret it." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stared at the phone, his jaw tightening. The call was just the beginning. The next day, he noticed a black car idling near his house for hours. When he stepped outside to confront the driver, the vehicle sped off, tires screeching. Later that week, a package arrived on his doorstep. A broken police badge wrapped in a crude note. "Your time is running out." Marcus reported each incident to the mayor's office, but the perpetrators remained elusive. Mayor Carter, visibly alarmed, urged him to consider additional security. "You're becoming a target, Marcus," he said. "I don't want this escalating further." "I've dealt with worse," Marcus replied, his tone resolute. "This won't stop me." The breaking point came on a cold, still night. Marcus was reviewing case files when he smelled smoke. At first, he dismissed it as coming from outside, but the scent grew stronger. Then he heard the faint crackle of flames. Rushing to the front of the house, he saw it. Fire consuming his porch. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and began battling the flames, but the blaze had already spread to the siding. Neighbors rushed to help as firefighters arrived, dousing the fire before it consumed the entire home. The aftermath was devastating. The porch was destroyed, the front door blackened and warped. Spray painted across the garage door were the words, "Traitor." The attack sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. As Marcus stood among the wreckage, his neighbors expressed their outrage. "This is crossing the line," one man said, shaking his head. Marcus remained stoic, but the message was clear. The fight for reform had made him a marked man. The tension came to a head during a closed-door meeting at the mayor's office, where senior police officials were gathered to discuss the ongoing reforms. Chief Steele, who had remained outwardly neutral, opened the discussion with a measured tone. "We need to address the growing unrest within the department," Steele began. "Morale is at an all-time low. Officers feel like they're under siege." One of the senior officers, Captain Bryant, stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Under siege? That's putting it lightly. These so-called reforms are destroying this department. Officers are afraid to do their jobs because they think every decision will land them in front of a civilian board." Marcus, seated at the far end of the table, remained silent as Bryant continued. "And let's not pretend we don't know who's to blame. General Daniels has been parading around, making us look like villains. He's turned the public against us." The room grew tense as all eyes turned to Marcus. Slowly, he stood, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to vilify anyone, Captain. I'm here to fix a broken system. If holding people accountable for their actions makes you uncomfortable, then perhaps you're part of the problem." Bryant slammed his fist on the table. "You've never walked a beat. You don't know what it's like out there. Don't stand there and lecture me about accountability." Marcus took a step closer, his presence commanding. "You're right. I haven't walked a beat, but I've led soldiers into combat where every decision could mean life or death. And do you know what we had? Accountability. Because without it, there's no trust. And without trust, there's chaos." Bryant opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by the mayor. "Enough!" Carter's voice echoed through the room. "This isn't a debate about who has it harder. We're here to make this city better, and that starts with ensuring our police force operates with integrity." The tension lingered, but the meeting continued, with Marcus outlining the next steps for implementing reforms. Though some officers remained visibly hostile, others seemed to soften, their resistance tempered by Marcus's conviction. Later that evening, Mayor Carter and Marcus sat in his office, the weight of the day's events heavy in the air. "You're making a lot of enemies," Carter said, his tone weary. "I'm not here to win friends," Marcus replied. "I'm here to do what's right." Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The department is fracturing. Bryant's not the only one who thinks this is a mistake. If we push too hard, we risk losing the trust of the officers altogether." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "And if we don't push hard enough, we risk losing the trust of the community. This isn't a negotiation, William. Change always comes with resistance. But the moment we back down, we lose everything we've worked for." The mayor nodded slowly. "You're right. But the pressure is mounting. We need a win. Something tangible to show the public these reforms are working." Marcus stood, his posture firm. "Then let's get to work. This isn't just about policies. It's about proving to everyone, officers and citizens alike, that these changes will make Hartford stronger." The attacks and resistance had only fueled Marcus's resolve. The fire at his home had been an attempt to intimidate him, to break his spirit. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, determined to see the reforms through. The first training session for Hartford's police force under the new reforms began with a mix of skepticism and outright hostility. The program, designed to address implicit bias and de-escalation tactics, was mandatory, but many officers attended begrudgingly. Marcus Daniels, at the forefront of these efforts, was there to observe and, if necessary, intervene. The room buzzed with low murmurs as officers filed in, their faces etched with skepticism. Some leaned against the walls, arms crossed, while others sat rigidly, avoiding eye contact. The instructor, a civilian expert in cultural sensitivity, introduced herself and outlined the objectives. "We're not here to point fingers," she began. "We're here to understand how biases, conscious or unconscious, affect our actions. Let's work together to recognize and address them." Before she could continue, a voice cut through the room. "This is ridiculous." Officer Daniels, a grizzled veteran with decades on the force, muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We don't need lectures from civilians who've never been in the field." The instructor paused, visibly startled. Marcus stood, his gaze fixed on Daniels. "Got something to say, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Daniels didn't back down. "Yeah, I do. We're out there risking our lives, and now we're being told we're the problem? It's insulting." Several officers nodded in agreement, emboldened by his defiance. Marcus walked to the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. "I understand your frustration, Daniels. Change isn't easy, and it's never comfortable. But let me ask you this. Have you ever considered how the people you serve feel? Do you think they see you as the solution or part of the problem?" Daniels sneered. "I do my job. If someone's got a problem with that, it's on them, not me." Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Let's test that theory." He turned to the instructor. "Run the role-playing exercise. I'll participate." The room shifted uneasily as the instructor set up the scenario. Marcus volunteered to play the role of a civilian being pulled over for a minor traffic infraction. Officer Lindstrom, a younger and more open-minded participant, was chosen to play the role of the officer. Marcus sat in a mock vehicle as Lindstrom approached, her demeanor professional but firm. "Sir, license and registration," she said, her tone neutral. "Why did you stop me?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with irritation. Lindstrom responded, "You were speeding. Please hand over your documents." The exchange escalated as Marcus played the part of a nervous and defensive driver. Lindstrom remained composed but firm, avoiding unnecessary escalation. "Stop," Marcus said, stepping out of character. He turned to the room. "Now let's switch roles. Officer Daniels, you're the civilian. I'll be the officer." Daniels hesitated but reluctantly stepped forward, clearly irritated. The tone of the exercise shifted dramatically. Marcus approached Daniels with a confrontational posture, his voice sharp and accusatory. "License and registration, now." Daniels frowned. "What's your problem? I wasn't doing anything wrong." Marcus leaned closer, his voice colder. "Don't question me. Just do what I said. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus continued to press Daniels, interrupting his attempts to explain and deliberately escalating the situation. When the exercise ended, Daniels looked visibly uncomfortable. That was different, he muttered. Marcus stepped back, addressing the room. That's what it feels like to be judged unfairly, to be treated like a criminal without cause. Imagine feeling that every time you see flashing lights behind you. The room was silent. For the first time, some officers seemed to truly grasp the weight of the community's grievances. After the exercise, the instructor facilitated a discussion. Officer Lindstrom spoke first. I didn't realize how much my tone could impact someone's reaction. Even when I'm trying to stay neutral, it can come off as aggressive. Another officer added hesitantly, I guess we don't think about how our actions look from the other side. We're just focused on getting the job done. Marcus nodded. That's the point of this training. Not to criticize, but to give you tools to approach situations with empathy and understanding. Trust me, it makes your job easier and safer. Daniels, still visibly shaken, finally spoke. I still think some of this is over the top, but I get it. I didn't like how that felt. Marcus walked over to Daniels, extending a hand. It takes courage to admit that. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this. Daniels hesitated, then shook Marcus's hand. By the end of the session, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. While not everyone was fully convinced, the seeds of understanding had been planted. The resistance wasn't gone, but it was starting to erode. Later, Mayor Carter called Marcus to check on the progress. How's it going? He asked. There's a long road ahead, Marcus replied. But today, we made a dent. That's all we can ask for. The workshops continued in the following weeks, each one building on the momentum of the last. Marcus knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, he felt that true cultural change was within reach. The community center buzzed with activity as residents from all over Hartford gathered for the dialogue event. The hall was packed, with standing room only. On stage, Marcus Daniels stood next to Mayor Carter and several community leaders, preparing to address the crowd. The tension was palpable. The room reflected the city's divide. Some attendees carried signs reading "Justice and Accountability Now," while others bore slogans like "Support Our Police." Officers in uniform lingered near the back, their expressions guarded. Marcus took a breath, stepping to the microphone. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady but firm. This isn't an easy conversation to have, but it's a necessary one. Tonight, we're here to listen, to learn, and to find common ground. A man in the front row interrupted, shouting, "What's there to talk about? You're just tearing down the police." The outburst was met with scattered applause and boos, underscoring the volatility of the crowd. Marcus raised a hand to quiet the room. I understand your concerns, he said, locking eyes with the man. But this isn't about tearing anything down. It's about building trust, something we've all lost. And that starts with accountability. The murmurs quieted as Marcus continued, sharing his vision for a more unified Hartford, one where community and police work together instead of against each other. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A group of protesters barged in, chanting loudly and waving signs. Security moved to intercept them, but before they could, someone hurled a glass bottle toward the stage. The projectile shattered at Marcus's feet, shards flying in every direction. One piece grazed his arm, drawing blood. Gasps rippled through the crowd as chaos threatened to erupt. Marcus staggered slightly but steadied himself, raising a hand to calm the audience. Stop, he called, his voice cutting through the noise. This isn't how we solve anything. The crowd froze, all eyes on Marcus. Despite the blood seeping through his sleeve, he stood tall, his expression unwavering. He stepped forward, addressing the agitators directly. If you're here to disrupt, you're not helping anyone. You're only proving that we need to have this conversation. So, either listen or leave. The tension lingered for a moment, but the protesters reluctantly backed down, retreating to the edges of the room. The audience watched in stunned silence as Marcus wiped the blood from his arm and returned to the microphone. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, his voice firm but calm. Anger without action is meaningless. If we want change, we have to be better than this. Violence solves nothing. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, but quickly growing. The crowd was captivated, not just by Marcus's words, but by his resolve. The event continued, with Marcus facilitating an open discussion. A young black man stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've been stopped by the police more times than I can count," he said. "I'm not a criminal, but that's how they treat me. How do you fix that?" An officer in the back responded, "We're not mind readers. If someone looks suspicious, we have to act. You want us to ignore our instincts?" The tension flared again, but Marcus stepped in. "This is exactly why we're here, to bridge this gap. Officers, you want to protect the community, but trust me when I say that profiling only breaks it down. And to the community, I hear your frustration, but dialogue, not blame, is how we move forward." Another voice joined the fray, a woman who introduced herself as Evelyn. "I've lived here for 70 years, she said, her tone measured but firm. "I've seen this city at its worst and its best. We can't afford to go backward. We have to trust each other, even if it's hard." Her words resonated, softening the edges of the room's hostility. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had shifted. Marcus's unwavering stance during the attack had earned the respect of many in the room, even those who had come to oppose him. As the event concluded, a young girl approached Marcus, her eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're really brave." Marcus smiled, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Bravery isn't about not being afraid," he said. "It's about doing what's right, even when you are." The next morning, headlines across Hartford praised Marcus's composure and resilience. The incident at the event became a rallying cry for supporters of the reforms, strengthening their resolve to push forward. "Last night was a turning point," Mayor Carter said during a private meeting with Marcus. "You showed them what leadership looks like." Marcus nodded but remained focused. "This is just one step. We've started the conversation, but now we have to make sure it leads somewhere." With the community more engaged than ever, Marcus and the mayor began planning the next phase of reforms, determined to build on the momentum and keep Hartford moving forward. The uproar over the Deshaun Carter case hit Hartford like a storm. Deshaun, a 22-year-old college student, had been pulled over for a broken taillight, but the encounter quickly escalated. A passerby recorded the incident on their phone, capturing the officer speaking to Deshaun in a condescending and aggressive tone, though no physical violence occurred. The footage went viral, reigniting tensions and pushing Marcus Daniels back into the spotlight. Marcus reviewed the video carefully. The officer's approach was unnecessarily confrontational, and Deshaun's visible fear was palpable. The situation didn't cross into outright misconduct, but it highlighted the exact behaviors the reforms sought to eliminate. The fallout was immediate. Deshaun's family, distrustful of the police and wary of any dialogue, refused to cooperate with the internal investigation. They declined all attempts by the department to meet, fearing further mistreatment or retaliation. Marcus knew that resolving this crisis required gaining the trust of Deshaun's family. Without their participation, any investigation or meaningful reform stemming from this case would stall. He decided to approach them personally. His first visit was met with hostility. Deshaun's mother, Cynthia, answered the door but left it half closed, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Carter, I'm Marcus Daniels," he began. "I'm here to help ensure your son's voice is heard." "I've seen what happens when people like you help," Cynthia replied curtly. "Nothing changes. They're still out there treating us like criminals." "I understand your fear," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But if we don't confront this head-on, nothing will ever change." Deshaun's story can be a catalyst for real accountability. Cynthia hesitated, her grip on the door tightening. "You don't know what it's like to live like this. To watch your son leave the house and not know if he'll come back." Marcus stepped closer, his voice softening. "You're right. I don't know that fear. But I know what it's like to lose people I care about, because I didn't act fast enough. I won't let that happen here." After a long pause, Cynthia nodded reluctantly. "Come back tomorrow. We'll talk as a family." The following evening, Marcus sat in the Carters' living room, facing Deshaun, Cynthia, and Deshaun's uncle, Eric. The tension was thick, every word weighed carefully. "I don't trust any of them," Eric said bluntly, crossing his arms. "They'll twist this around. Make it look like Deshaun did something wrong. Deshaun, sitting quietly, finally spoke up. It's not just about me. This happens to people like us every day, but no one cares unless there's a camera. Marcus nodded. You're right, Deshaun, and that's why this moment matters. The camera gave you a voice. Now you have a choice. Use it, or let them control the narrative. Eric's expression hardened. And what happens when nothing changes? When this is just another case that gets swept under the rug? Marcus met his gaze. That's not going to happen. Because I'm not going to let it. But I can't do it alone. I need your help. Deshaun leaned forward, his voice firm. What do you need us to do? Tell your story, Marcus said simply. Share your truth. Let the investigation expose what needs to change. This is bigger than one traffic stop. It's about fixing a system that's been broken for far too long. Reluctantly, the Carters agreed to participate. The next day, Deshaun gave a formal statement, and the investigation gained traction. But as progress was made, the backlash grew. One night, as Marcus walked to his car after a late meeting, he noticed a figure lingering in the shadows of the parking lot. The person stepped forward, their face obscured by a hood. Stay out of this, Daniels, the stranger said, their voice low and threatening, or someone's going to get hurt. Marcus didn't flinch. I've heard worse threats than that. If you've got a message, deliver it directly. The figure hesitated before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Marcus stood his ground, his pulse steady. He reported the incident to the mayor's office, but the encounter was a stark reminder of the risks involved. The threats escalated further when Eric Carter received an anonymous note shoved under his door. It read, "Keep quiet, or you'll regret it." Shaken but defiant, Eric called Marcus immediately. "This is what we were afraid of," Eric said. "They're trying to scare us into silence." Marcus reassured him. "That's exactly why we can't back down. Intimidation only works if we let it." He arranged for increased security near the Carters' home, ensuring their safety as the investigation continued. The tension reached its peak during a community forum where the Carters shared their experience. Deshaun spoke with quiet strength, recounting the fear he felt during the traffic stop and the frustration of being treated like a suspect. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. "But he looked at me and decided I was a problem." The audience, a mix of community members and police officers, listened intently. One officer stood up, visibly frustrated. "We're just trying to do our jobs," he said. "Not every stop is about race or bias. Sometimes it's just about keeping people safe." Deshaun responded calmly. "But if you can't see how your actions affect people like me, how can we ever trust you?" Marcus stepped in, mediating the heated exchange. "This is why dialogue is so important. Officers, you want to protect this community, but to do that, the community needs to trust you. And trust starts with accountability." The forum ended on a tense but hopeful note, with both sides agreeing to continue the conversation. The backlash against Hartford's police reforms reached a boiling point when a group of former officers loyal to Mike Carter staged a protest. They gathered outside City Hall, waving signs with slogans like "Reinstate Carter" and "Stop the Witch Hunt." Tensions were high, and their numbers swelled as disgruntled allies and sympathizers joined the demonstration. Initially, the protest was loud but contained. Chants echoed through the streets, and the crowd pressed against barriers set up by local authorities. However, as the hours dragged on, frustration boiled over. A bottle flew from the crowd, smashing against the steps of City Hall. It was the spark that ignited chaos. Protesters began kicking over garbage cans, shoving security personnel, and even smashing windows of nearby businesses. One group toppled a statue in the square, marking it with spray paint. Carter was right. Inside City Hall, Marcus and Mayor Carter watched the escalating scene through the large windows of the mayor's office. "This can't go on," Carter said, his tone strained. "The public's losing faith in our ability to keep order." Marcus's jaw tightened. "We can't back down now. Giving in would only reinforce the message that intimidation works." "I'm not suggesting we cave," Carter replied. "But we need to address this before someone gets seriously hurt." Stepping outside, Marcus approached the crowd, flanked by security. The hostile energy seemed to turn toward him as the protesters recognized the man they blamed for Carter's dismissal. "Here he is," a voice shouted. "The man tearing this city apart." Several people surged forward, but the police held the line. Marcus raised a hand, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough!" he bellowed. The sheer force of his tone stunned the crowd into a momentary hush. "If you have something to say, say it. But this destruction only proves why these reforms are necessary." A burly man stepped forward, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. "You've ruined a good cop's life. Carter didn't deserve this." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. Carter's actions ruined his own career. "This isn't about punishing good cops. It's about holding everyone to the same standard, including him." The man started to argue, but Marcus continued. "You think this helps your cause? Smashing windows, threatening people? All you're doing is proving that change is needed. If you want to be heard, do it with words, not destruction." The crowd murmured, divided. Some still shouted angrily, while others appeared to reconsider their actions. Slowly, the intensity of the protest began to wane. The next morning, the damage from the night's violence was clear. Shattered glass, overturned planters, and graffiti scrawled across city buildings. Detractors seized the opportunity to attack the reforms, accusing Marcus and the mayor of destabilizing the city. But amid the chaos, a glimmer of hope emerged. During a town hall meeting called to address the recent unrest, a young man named Jalen stood to speak. He was barely out of his teens, with an earnest demeanor that immediately caught the room's attention. "My name is Jalen," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "A year ago, I didn't trust the police. I avoided them at all costs because every interaction felt like a trap. But something changed recently." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "A few months ago, I was walking home late at night when I saw an officer pull over a young guy in my neighborhood. I stopped to watch because, honestly, I expected it to go bad. But it didn't. The officer was calm, respectful, and even explained why he stopped the guy before letting him go. That might not sound like much, but to me, it was everything. It showed me that maybe things can change." Jalen turned to Marcus, his voice growing firmer. "I know it's because of what you're doing. The reforms are working. And I just want to say thank you for not giving up, even when it feels like the whole city is against you." The room erupted in applause, the sound cutting through the lingering tension. Jalen's testimony quickly gained traction on social media, with clips of his speech shared widely. For every angry detractor demanding a return to the old ways, there was now a voice like Jalen's, proof that the reforms were beginning to make a difference. At a press conference later that week, Mayor Carter acknowledged the damage caused by the protests, but reaffirmed his commitment to change. "Progress is never easy," he said. "But stories like Jalen's remind us why we must stay the course. These reforms are about building a city where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." Marcus also spoke, addressing both supporters and critics. "I know change is hard. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths and adapt in ways we don't always like. But change is also necessary. We owe it to the next generation to create a Hartford that's better than the one we inherited." Behind the scenes, Marcus worked tirelessly to ensure the reforms continued despite the mounting resistance. He met with business owners affected by the protests, offering both apologies and assurances. He visited schools and community centers, sharing stories of progress and listening to concerns. Though the road was far from smooth, the tide was beginning to turn. Stories like Jalen's became more common, proof that the reforms were slowly reshaping the culture of Hartford's police force. Officers who had once been skeptical of the changes began to see their benefits, and community members who had felt alienated began to rebuild trust. As the city moved forward, Marcus remained a steady presence, his unwavering commitment to justice and accountability, a beacon for those willing to fight for progress. The package arrived in a plain brown box, addressed to Marcus Daniels at the mayor's office. It bore no return address, but that wasn't unusual given the anonymous letters and messages he'd received over the past few months. What set this one apart was its weight and the faint ticking sound when a secretary moved it onto his desk. "Mr. Daniels," she said hesitantly, "this feels off." Marcus, seated at his desk, paused, studying the box. His years of military training kicked in. "Leave the room," he instructed calmly. "Now." The secretary hesitated. What about go? Marcus barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. As soon as she left, Marcus backed away and called the bomb squad. Minutes later, a team arrived, evacuating the office and carefully examining the package. Their lead technician emerged, his face grim. It's a bomb, he confirmed. Crude but effective. Another few minutes and it could have detonated. The news spread quickly. A failed assassination attempt on the man leading Hartford's reforms shocked the city. The attack polarized the community further, with some attributing it to rogue elements resisting change, while others questioned if it was a false flag orchestrated to garner sympathy. Mayor Carter called an emergency press conference, standing beside Marcus. "This cowardly act will not deter us," Carter declared. "It only strengthens our resolve to see these reforms through." Marcus took the podium, his voice calm but resolute. "Fear tactics like this are meant to silence us, to make us question whether the fight is worth it. Let me be clear. I will not be silenced. Hartford deserves better, and I intend to see that it gets better." The attack forced Marcus to take additional security measures. His movements were now closely monitored, and his team vetted every item that arrived at his office or home. Despite these precautions, Marcus remained active, attending community events, police workshops, and public forums. At one such forum, a young woman stood to address Marcus directly. "You've been through so much," she said, her voice trembling. "Why don't you just step back? Let someone else take over. Isn't it too much for one person to bear?" Marcus met her gaze, his tone measured. "This fight isn't about me. It's about all of us. If I step back, what message does that send? That intimidation works? That fear wins? I won't give them that victory. We've come too far to stop now." His words drew applause, a reminder that even amid adversity, Marcus's leadership inspired hope. The reforms began to show tangible results. Complaints of police misconduct dropped, and community police relations slowly improved. Officers who once resisted the changes now embraced them, recognizing the benefits of trust and transparency. At a ceremony honoring Marcus's contributions, Chief Steele, who had been skeptical of the reforms, publicly acknowledged his transformation. "When this started, I didn't think it would work," he admitted. "But I've seen the difference. These reforms aren't just policies. They're building a stronger, more united Hartford." The applause that followed was genuine, a sign that the city's wounds were starting to heal. Despite the progress, threats against Marcus continued. Anonymous letters accused him of destroying the police force. Rumors spread, painting him as an outsider manipulating the system for personal gain. But Marcus faced it all with unflinching resolve. During a late-night interview with a national news outlet, the reporter asked him, "After everything you've endured, the threats, the attacks, the resistance, what keeps you going?" Marcus's answer was simple but powerful. "The people of Hartford, the single mother who thanked me for making her neighborhood safer. The young boy who told me he wanted to be like me when he grows up. The officers who've come to me and said, 'We're better now because of this.' That's what keeps me going." This isn't just a job, it's a duty. In the final months of his leadership, Marcus oversaw the implementation of long-term initiatives, a mentorship program pairing officers with at-risk youth, community policing divisions aimed at fostering relationships between neighborhoods and law enforcement, a civilian oversight committee that had gained credibility and authority in handling complaints. These efforts cemented Marcus's legacy as a reformer who turned adversity into opportunity. On the anniversary of the first reforms, Hartford held a citywide celebration. Thousands gathered in the Central Park, where Marcus was the keynote speaker. As he stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause, a diverse mix of citizens and officers united in their respect for his leadership. Standing at the podium, Marcus looked out at the sea of faces. For the first time, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been grueling, marked by betrayal, violence, and loss. But it had also been transformative. "I'm not here to celebrate me," he began. "I'm here to celebrate all of you. The people who refused to let fear win. The people who stood up, spoke out, and demanded better. Hartford isn't perfect, but we've proven that progress is possible when we work together." He paused, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. This is just the beginning. The work we've done here will ripple far beyond this city. It's a blueprint for what's possible when courage and conviction meet. The crowd rose to their feet, cheering as Marcus stepped back. He had come full circle, from a soldier fighting battles abroad to a leader fighting for justice at home. Marcus Daniels' journey wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and community. His unwavering determination in the face of adversity reminded us that change is never easy, but it's always worth pursuing. From the explosive challenges he faced to the bridges he built between law enforcement and the community, Marcus's legacy continues to inspire Hartford and beyond. Now the question is, what would you do to stand up for justice in your own community? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and transformation. Together, let's keep the conversation going and inspire change.
The air was crisp, and the soft glow of the streetlights bathed the upscale shopping district in a calm, muted light. It was well past closing time, and most of the stores were dark, their displays reflecting the wealth that flowed through this part of the city. Marcus Johnson stood outside his own storefront, staring at the sleek mannequins behind the glass, his face illuminated by the soft light of the display. He smiled slightly, admiring the layout. It had taken months to get everything perfect, and now the store was ready for the holiday rush. But to Officer Robert Blake, this scene looked different. A lone man standing in front of a closed store at night, lingering longer than anyone should. He tightened his grip on his flashlight as he watched from across the street. It wasn't the first time he'd seen this kind of behavior, and in his line of work, it was better to be safe than sorry. Robert crossed the street with purposeful strides. His hand rested instinctively on the grip of his holstered gun. "Excuse me, sir," he called, his voice firm and authoritative. Marcus turned, surprised but not alarmed. "Evening, officer," he said calmly, his hands slipping into his coat pockets to warm them against the cool night air. "What are you doing here?" Robert's eyes swept over Marcus, noting the expensive suit but not letting it sway him. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I'm just looking at my store. Everything seems fine," he said with a nod toward the window. "Your store?" Robert echoed, his tone thick with disbelief. "Yes, my store," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though a slight edge of irritation crept in. Robert stepped closer, his face hardening. "Mind taking your hands out of your pockets?" There was a tension building between them now, palpable in the cold air. Marcus obliged slowly, raising his hands to show he had nothing to hide. "I'm not sure what this is about, but there's no need for concern. I own the place." Robert's suspicion only deepened. He'd seen this kind of smooth talk before, people trying to act like they belonged somewhere they didn't. "Can I see some ID?" Marcus frowned. "ID? For what?" "For loitering around a store after hours," Robert said, his voice sharp now. "Store owners don't usually hang around like this, especially not at night." "I told you, I own this store," Marcus repeated, his voice now edged with frustration. "You don't need to. ID now." Robert interrupted, his tone final. Marcus, unwilling to cause a scene, reached into his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Robert snatched it from his hand, his eyes scanning the name and address. He didn't know why, but something about this situation still didn't sit right with him. "This doesn't prove you own the place," Robert said, handing the license back. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Look, if you're this concerned, I can call my staff or my lawyer. This is getting ridiculous." But Robert wasn't listening. The doubt had already solidified in his mind. "Turn around," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "What?" Marcus blinked in disbelief. "I just told you who I am." "This is insane." "I said turn around," Robert repeated, this time louder, his hand moving to Marcus's shoulder to spin him around. "You're under arrest for attempted burglary." Marcus froze, his heart thudding in his chest. "Are you serious?" he asked, incredulous. "You can't be serious." Robert wasn't joking. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around Marcus's wrists, and for the first time, the sting of humiliation began to set in. As Robert forced his arms behind his back, Marcus could feel the eyes of passers-by on him. Those who hadn't noticed before now stared, whispering to one another. No one intervened. "What are you doing?" Marcus struggled, his voice rising. "This is my store. I just told you." Robert ignored him, pulling Marcus toward the patrol car. "Save it for the station," he muttered. Marcus's voice shook with disbelief as he was marched through the quiet street. "You didn't even ask any real questions. You don't even know what's happening here." He could hear the murmurs of a few onlookers, could see their phones pointed in his direction, recording his humiliation. His blood boiled. Robert shoved Marcus into the back seat of the patrol car, slamming the doors shut behind him. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion as Marcus sat there, staring at the shop. The one he had built from the ground up, the one that was supposed to represent everything he had worked for. And now, in the blink of an eye, his success, his dignity, was being shattered by a man who refused to believe him. Robert slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine. Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but simmering with anger. "You're making a mistake," he said. "A huge mistake. When you find out who I am." Robert cut him off. "I'll let your lawyer handle that." The patrol car pulled away, leaving the quiet street behind. As they drove, Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts racing. How many times had he been in situations like this? How many times had he been judged before anyone even listened? But this was different. This wasn't some random passerby with a sideways glance. This was a police officer, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, who should have known better. The silence in the car was thick, and Robert didn't look back as they sped toward the station. Marcus's jaw clenched. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Not this time. Not after everything he had done to get here. And Robert, still convinced he had caught another criminal, had no idea the storm that was about to come. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Marcus's wrists as they pulled up to the precinct. The ride had been silent, thick with tension, but now the reality of his situation was sinking in. His mouth was dry, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but one overpowered the rest. The disbelief that this was happening to him, again. As Robert parked the car and stepped out, he didn't look at Marcus. His movements were routine, cold, as though he'd done this 1,000 times before, and Marcus was just another criminal. Robert opened the back door, yanking Marcus out of the car with a firm grip on his arm. Marcus gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to shout. He knew that any resistance, any sign of frustration, would only make things worse. "Keep moving," Robert ordered, pushing Marcus toward the station entrance. The station buzzed with activity, officers moving about, phones ringing, voices echoing off the walls. But the moment Marcus was let in, the room seemed to shift. Conversations quieted, curious eyes glanced over, and for a brief moment, there was a ripple of confusion among some of the officers who recognized him. Marcus caught one or two faces he'd seen at community meetings, officers who had been invited to the opening of the complex. But no one stepped forward. Robert led Marcus to a bench, roughly pushing him down before walking over to the booking desk. "Got a possible B&E," Robert said flatly, filling out paperwork. Caught him outside one of the shops in the Harper complex. The officer behind the desk, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, looked over at Marcus, frowning slightly. "The Harper complex? You sure?" Robert nodded, glancing back at Marcus with a look that said he was sure. Said he was the owner, but he shrugged dismissively. The woman's eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment before she continued processing the paperwork. "We'll need to check that out." Marcus, sitting on the bench, couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had spent years building relationships with the community, with law enforcement, making sure his complex was seen as a positive contribution to the city. And now he was sitting here, handcuffed, like a common criminal, with no one willing to question Robert's judgment. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising tide of anger and humiliation. This wasn't the first time he'd been misjudged, but this was different. This was happening in a city where his name carried weight, where he had earned respect. He thought that meant something, but in this moment, it was clear to him that, to Robert, it meant nothing. Suddenly, Robert's phone buzzed. He looked at it and frowned, walking away to take the call. Marcus watched him go, tension coiling in his chest. This was his chance. He needed to get someone on his side. someone who would listen. He caught the eye of the officer behind the desk, her expression still uncertain. "I need my lawyer," Marcus said quietly, forcing his voice to stay calm. "This is a misunderstanding." The woman hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I'll see what I can do," she said, but it was clear she was in no rush. Marcus exhaled slowly, glancing around the station. He had always been the kind of man who believed in the system, who thought that working hard, doing things the right way, would shield him from situations like this. But now, the cracks in that belief were widening, and the weight of his experience bore down on him. He looked up as Robert returned, his expression different now. Tense, almost irritated. "Marcus Johnson, huh?" Robert muttered, clearly having just learned more than he had expected during his phone call. "The owner of the Harper Complex?" "That's what I've been telling you," Marcus said, his voice tight. "But you didn't want to hear it." Robert ignored the comment, glancing toward the booking desk. "We're waiting on verification," he said brusquely, but there was a crack in his composure now. He knew he had messed up. The tension in the air shifted. Marcus could feel the officers around them start to murmur, glancing between him and Robert with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. There was no mistaking it now. People were starting to realize what had happened, the error that had been made. Marcus had been telling the truth from the beginning, and Robert's confidence in his arrest was crumbling. Moments later, the door to the station swung open, and in walked Marcus's lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, a tall, imposing man in a perfectly tailored suit. His face was set in a mask of professionalism, but there was fire in his eyes. "Marcus," he said, his voice steady but edged with concern. "Are you all right?" Marcus nodded, but the frustration was palpable. "I've been sitting here in handcuffs for over an hour. That's how I'm doing." Jonathan turned to Robert, his expression hardening. "You've made a grave mistake, officer. I'm here to make sure it's corrected immediately." Robert, visibly uncomfortable now, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "We're still verifying." "Verifying?" Jonathan cut him off sharply. "This is the owner of the entire complex. You arrested him without cause, based on assumptions. We'll be pursuing legal action if this isn't rectified immediately." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the officer behind the desk looked up, her eyes wide. "It's confirmed," she said quietly. "He's the owner." The room fell silent. Marcus watched Robert's face drain of color, the realization of his mistake hitting him like a wave. Marcus stood up, the weight of the cuffs still on his wrists. "Now what?" he asked, his voice low but dangerous. Robert fumbled for words, but none came. The entire station seemed to be watching now, waiting for what would come next. Marcus's eyes locked on Robert's, unblinking. "Take the cuffs off," Jonathan demanded, stepping forward. Robert, his hands shaking slightly, reached for the keys and unlocked the cuffs. The moment they were off, Marcus rubbed his wrists, the sting of humiliation still burning beneath his skin. "This isn't over," Jonathan said coldly, stepping between Marcus and Robert. Not by a long shot, and as Marcus stood there, free but still simmering with anger, he knew that Jonathan was right. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the air was thick with tension as Marcus sat in the conference room of his lawyer's office, his phone buzzing incessantly. The story had broken overnight, spreading like wildfire. Local news stations picked up the incident, and social media was ablaze with footage taken by bystanders. The video of Marcus, handcuffed, being marched into the precinct by Robert Blake. It was the humiliation he had feared, now playing out on every screen. Jonathan sat across from him, his usual composed demeanor intact. "We can sue them, Marcus. We have everything we need. Unlawful arrest, racial profiling, damages to your reputation. The media is on this. We can hit hard." Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours press down on him. "And then what?" he said quietly. "We win, and it's another headline for a week. Another black man wrongfully arrested. Then they move on to the next story." Jonathan frowned. "This isn't just another headline. This is different. You're a public figure. This is a high-profile case." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "It's a story because of who I am. But this happens to people every day, John. They don't own businesses, they don't have money, and they definitely don't have lawyers like you on speed dial. What happens to them? Jonathan stared at him, unsure how to respond. Marcus wasn't angry at him. He knew his lawyer was only doing his job, but this was bigger than just a lawsuit. The anger he felt wasn't just for himself. It was for every person who had been through what he had, with no way to fight back. I don't want to just sue them, Marcus continued, standing up and pacing the room. I want this to mean something. I want them to listen. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. What are you thinking? Marcus paused by the window, staring out at the city below, the skyline glittering in the morning light. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. I'm going to do a press conference, not just to tell my side of the story, but to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. I want people to know what happened, and I want real changes. Training, reform, something that actually matters. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. You're serious? Dead serious, Marcus said, turning to face him. This can't just be about me anymore. It's about something bigger. Jonathan leaned back, nodding slowly. All right, I'll get the team to organize it. We'll make sure everything's in place. Later that afternoon, Robert sat in his superior's office, facing the consequences of his actions. Captain Davis, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, sat behind her desk, arms crossed, her sharp gaze fixed on Robert. The room was tense, the air heavy with disappointment. I just got off the phone with the chief, Captain Davis said, her voice low but controlled. He's furious. Do you have any idea what you've done? Robert swallowed hard, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I made a mistake, he said quietly, though the words felt empty. Even as he said them, they didn't feel like enough to cover the magnitude of what had happened. A mistake? Captain Davis leaned forward. This isn't just a mistake, Blake. You arrested the owner of the very complex you patrol. You racially profiled him, ignored his explanations, and now this department is facing a public relations nightmare. A mistake doesn't cover that. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I thought. No, she interrupted, her voice hardening. That's the problem. You didn't think. You assumed. You let your biases make decisions for you. And now it's blowing up in our faces. The silence in the room was suffocating. Robert could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his shame growing with each word. What happens now? He asked, barely able to meet her gaze. Captain Davis sighed, leaning back in her chair. The department is putting you on probation, and you'll undergo mandatory anti-bias training. The press is going to be all over this, and frankly, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But right now, I need to know, do you understand what you did wrong? Robert nodded, but his voice faltered. I didn't listen. I assumed he was guilty. You didn't just assume he was guilty, she said firmly. You assumed he was guilty because of who he is, because of the color of his skin. The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on treating people fairly. But sitting here, facing the consequences of his actions, he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He had let his prejudices guide him, and now he was paying the price. Later that day, Marcus stood in front of a crowd of reporters and flashing cameras. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he was resolute. Jonathan stood beside him, along with a few community leaders who had come to support his cause. The microphone crackled as he cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. Yesterday, I was wrongfully arrested outside of my own business, Marcus began, his voice steady. Not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked. Because I am a black man in a society where, too often, my skin color is seen as a threat before anyone asks a single question. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zooming in on his face. Marcus continued, his tone calm, but filled with purpose. This isn't just about me. I was lucky enough to have resources, to be able to call my lawyer, to have people who could help me. But there are countless others who don't have that luxury. This is about them. This is about the systemic issues in our policing, in our society, that lead to situations like this happening over and over again. He glanced at Jonathan, who nodded in quiet support, and then looked back at the cameras. I don't want revenge. I want change. Real, meaningful change. I want to work with the police department to implement mandatory anti-bias training for all officers. I want to make sure no one has to go through what I did." The room buzzed with murmurs as Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. He wasn't just here to talk about what happened to him. He was here to spark a conversation that couldn't be ignored. "And to the officer who arrested me," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly, "I hope you learn from this. Not just for yourself, but for everyone you encounter in the future. We can't keep living in a world where assumptions lead to injustice." As the press conference ended, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and the change he was fighting for wouldn't come easily. But he was ready for it. Robert watched the press conference from his apartment, alone. His phone had been buzzing all day, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Watching Marcus speak, hearing the words he hadn't been ready to confront, made his stomach twist with guilt. He had thought of himself as one of the good ones, a cop who followed the rules, who never let his personal feelings interfere. But now, as Marcus's words echoed in his mind, he realized just how blind he had been. Robert sat in the locker room of the precinct, his uniform still neatly pressed, but it felt heavier than usual. The echoes of Marcus's speech from the press conference lingered in his mind. His colleagues had mostly stopped speaking to him, and even the few that did exchanged cautious glances as if he were contagious. He could feel their judgment, their discomfort. He had become the face of a scandal that none of them wanted to be part of. He rubbed his hands over his face, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. He had been placed on probation, and the mandatory anti-bias training was starting in a few hours. The station buzzed as usual, but there was a palpable tension in the air whenever he walked through the halls. The locker room door creaked open, and Officer Jenkins, a colleague Robert had worked with for years, walked in. He glanced at Robert, then quickly looked away, heading for his locker. "Hey, Jenkins," Robert called out, his voice tentative. Jenkins hesitated before responding. "Blake." The silence between them stretched, heavy and awkward. Robert could sense Jenkins's unease, and it gnawed at him. Jenkins had been a friend, someone he'd trusted on long shifts, someone who'd had his back. But now, there was a wall between them, a barrier that Robert had put up himself, without even realizing it. "Listen," Robert started, his voice low, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't think." Jenkins slammed his locker shut, cutting Robert off. He turned, his eyes hard. "That's the problem, Blake. You didn't think. You didn't ask. You just," Jenkins shook his head in disbelief. "You just assumed. Like it was nothing." Robert opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he say? Jenkins was right. There was no defense. Jenkins grabbed his gear and headed for the door, but before he left, he turned back, his face a mixture of frustration and something Robert hadn't expected, disappointment. "You're better than this, man. Or at least, I thought you were." And with that, he was gone, leaving Robert alone with his guilt. Across town, Marcus sat at his desk in his office, staring at the stream of emails and messages flooding in. The press conference had garnered more attention than he had anticipated. Civil rights groups, community leaders, even local politicians had reached out, all wanting to support his cause. On one hand, it felt empowering. He was using his platform for something greater, something that could truly make a difference. But on the other, the weight of it was exhausting. "Marcus," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Sarah, his assistant, standing in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "You all right?" Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, Sarah. I'm trying to do the right thing, but it's a lot. More than I expected." She walked over and placed a folder on his desk. "I know, but you're not alone in this. There's a whole community behind you now. People want to see change, and they believe in you." Marcus nodded slowly, appreciating her words, but the burden still felt heavy. "It's just, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted to run my business, live my life. And now," Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes full of empathy. "Now you're doing something bigger than that. You're standing up for something that needs to be addressed. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been in your shoes, and for all the people who could be next." Marcus exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. She was right. This was about more than just his experience. It was about the countless others who didn't have a voice, who had been humiliated and mistreated without the chance to fight back. He had a platform, and he needed to use it. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly. "I needed that." She smiled softly, standing up. "You've got a meeting with the community leaders at 4. I'll make sure everything's ready." As Sarah left, Marcus glanced at the folder she had dropped on his desk. It contained the proposal for the anti-bias training initiative he had discussed at the press conference. He had drafted it with his lawyer and several community advocates, outlining a plan for collaboration with the police department. It was bold, ambitious, and if implemented, it could make real change. But it wasn't going to be easy. Robert walked into the training room, feeling every pair of eyes on him as he took a seat in the back. The room was filled with officers, some there voluntarily, others not so much. The instructor, a tall man with a calm but authoritative presence, stood at the front, his arms crossed as he waited for everyone to settle. "All right," the instructor began, his voice firm but not unkind. "We're here to talk about something that's been an issue in this country for far too long. Implicit bias." Robert's stomach twisted as the instructor's words echoed in the small room. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who didn't let emotions get in the way of his job. But now, sitting here, it was becoming painfully clear that he had been blind to the biases he carried. "As officers, we have to be aware of our biases," the instructor continued, "because whether we realize it or not, those biases affect the way we do our jobs. They affect how we see people, how we treat them, and the decisions we make." Robert felt his face flush as the instructor's words hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, wishing he could disappear. The training continued, the instructor walking the group through real-life examples, statistics, and stories from officers who had recognized their own biases and worked to change them. At one point, he paused, looking around the room. "Here's the thing," he said, his voice softening slightly. "We're not here to point fingers or lay blame. We're here to learn, to grow. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But what matters is how we choose to confront them." Robert stared at the floor, his mind racing. He had spent his whole career believing that being a good cop meant following the rules, making quick decisions in the heat of the moment. But now, he was beginning to see how much he had missed. He had let his assumptions guide him, had let his fear and bias cloud his judgment. When the session ended, Robert lingered behind, lost in thought. As the room cleared, the instructor approached him, his expression unreadable. "Officer Blake," he said quietly. Robert looked up, meeting the man's eyes. "You're not the first officer to be here because of a mistake," the instructor said. "But you've got a choice now. You can either learn from this and become better, or you can let it consume you. That's up to you." Robert nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to the way things were. That evening, Marcus sat at home, watching the news. The footage from the press conference played again, but this time, something else caught his attention. A segment about the anti-bias training initiative had been aired, showing images of officers in the same training program Robert had just attended. Change was slow, but it was happening, and for the first time since the arrest, Marcus felt a small glimmer of hope. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it. A few weeks had passed since the press conference, and life was slowly returning to something resembling normal for Marcus, but it wasn't the same. He had gone back to his office at the complex, overseeing the day-to-day operations of his stores, but the weight of the events still hung over him. The world had shifted, and his place in it felt different now. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, some offering words of support, others simply staring, unsure of how to engage. The attention was overwhelming at times, but Marcus knew it was necessary. His voice had become part of a larger conversation about racial injustice and police reform, a conversation that was far from over. The initiative he had pushed for, the anti-bias training, had gained traction. Several other business owners and community leaders had joined forces with him, and they were making real strides with local government and the police department. The first wave of training sessions was already underway, and more were scheduled in the coming months. But today was different. Today, Marcus had been invited to the police station, a place he hadn't been since the day of his arrest. This time, though he wasn't being brought in under suspicion. He was coming as an invited guest to witness a new chapter in the department's training. He had mixed feelings about it, to say the least. He parked his car outside the station, the same building where he had been humiliated and handcuffed, and took a deep breath before stepping out. Jonathan had wanted to come with him, but Marcus insisted on going alone. This was something he needed to do for himself. As he walked into the station, the same buzz of activity greeted him. But this time, the eyes that followed him were different. Some filled with respect, others still guarded. He was greeted at the entrance by Captain Davis, who offered a polite but professional nod. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. Marcus shook her hand, noting the tension in her shoulders. He wasn't naive. He knew this was as much about the department's saving face as it was about genuine change. But still, it was a step in the right direction. "I appreciate the invitation," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "I'm here to see that this is more than just a gesture." Captain Davis nodded. "I understand. Let's go to the training room." As they walked down the halls, Marcus couldn't help but notice the stares of the officers around him. Some glanced away quickly. Others held his gaze for a second longer, but no one said a word. The walls seemed to echo with the tension of his previous visit, but Marcus kept his focus forward. When they reached the training room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, a group of officers was seated, listening to the instructor, one of the same men who had led Robert's first session. As Marcus stepped in, all eyes turned to him. The room fell quiet, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of their scrutiny. But he held his head high, refusing to be intimidated. He recognized Robert immediately, sitting near the back. Their eyes met for the first time since that night, and Robert's face flushed with a mixture of shame and something else. Remorse, perhaps. Marcus didn't look away, and neither did Robert. The tension between them was palpable, but this time it felt different. This time, there was an understanding. The instructor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Thank you all for being here," he said, addressing the room but glancing at Marcus as well. "Today, we're going to continue our work on understanding and confronting implicit biases and how they affect the decisions we make in the field. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone who has been instrumental in bringing these changes to our department." The instructor gestured toward Marcus, and all eyes turned to him again. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had spoken in front of crowds before, at the press conference, at business meetings, but this felt different. These were the people who had the power to make real changes in their daily actions, to prevent what happened to him from happening to someone else. "I'm not here today to talk about what happened to me," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm. "You've all seen the footage. You've heard the story. What I'm here to talk about is what happens next." The room was silent, everyone listening intently. "We all carry biases," Marcus continued. "Some of us recognize them, some of us don't. But those biases affect the way we see the world, the way we see each other. And when you carry a badge, those biases can have real consequences, life or death consequences." His words hung in the air, the gravity of them impossible to ignore. "I don't blame every officer in this room for what happened to me," Marcus said, glancing at Robert for a brief second. "But I do expect every officer in this room to learn from it, to do better. Because the truth is, this isn't just about one bad day or one bad decision. It's about a system that's been broken for far too long, and it's on all of us to fix it." He paused, letting the weight of his message sink in. "I'm not here to lecture you," Marcus said. "I'm here to work with you, to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's going to take all of us listening, learning, and making changes. Real changes." When he finished speaking, the room was quiet for a moment, and then, one by one, the officers began to nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start. After the session, Robert waited outside the station, knowing that Marcus would eventually come out. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to say something. As Marcus emerged, Robert stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, his posture unsure. "Marcus," Robert began, his voice low. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For not listening, for assuming, for all of it." Marcus stopped, his eyes meeting Robert's. There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them. Then, finally, Marcus nodded. "I appreciate that, Robert," Marcus said. "But it's not just about me. It's about what you do from here." Robert nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I've been going through the training, and it's opened my eyes to a lot. I've got a long way to go, but I'm trying." Marcus studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Robert hesitated, then took it, the handshake solidifying a tentative understanding between them. "I hope you do more than try," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "We need more than just effort. We need action." Robert nodded again, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. As Marcus drove home that evening, the weight of the past few weeks finally began to lift. The road ahead was still long, but he had taken the first steps. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but with enough pressure, with enough voices demanding better, real progress could be made. He had become a symbol of that change, something he hadn't asked for, but had accepted nonetheless. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. For him, for Robert, for everyone.